Tilth Alliance works with small scale growers in and around the kind of Seattle metro area. We also work with farmers and gardeners statewide on education and advocacy programs within the fields of organic agriculture. We have programs for children and youth, nutrition programs for seniors. There are lots of fun ways to get involved. If you're curious and would like to learn more, you can check out our beautiful new website at tilthalliance.org. This is a great place to get more information and learn about our various different programs. Among the programs, there's also the Master Composter Sustainability Steward program. So if you really want to go into like a deep dive into compost, you could even check out that program, which is on your resource sheet. Additionally, my goal today is to answer as many of the questions that you have that come up during class, but I'm sure there may be questions I don't know the answer to, or questions that you come up for you after the class. And so in that case, I'm going to go ahead and refer you to the Garden Hotline, which is a free resource that's available to us. You can call them, email them. The Garden Hotline is staffed by a group of professional gardeners and horticulturalists whose job it is to help you figure out what's going on in your garden or what's going on with your compost. And you can reach out to them with questions. They are a wonderful resource. Yes, Donna, the class is being recorded. So yes, and then a little bit about myself. I've been with Tilth Alliance now for about almost 3 years. And prior to that, my background was actually in small scale organic vegetable production, which I did for about 7 years. And then I went back to school to study education. And so here I am combining my love of learning with my love of growing things. And compost is a huge and essential piece of growing healthy, vigorous plants. And so I'm excited to talk with you all about that this evening. And one last thing, before we get started is I have been, part of my journey as a farmer, a gardener. I think of caring for land, making compost, doing all of these things that we do as, just caretakers of place. As like there's the things we do because we care about the environment, we care about our community and our health. And then I think a big piece of that too is learning about the place where we are growing, where we are making our compost, where we have our hands in the soil, and about the histories of those places as well. So I've made a practice at the beginning of my classes, and when applicable, can dig into a little bit more history, but trying to make space for acknowledging the land that we're on and the place where we are at the beginning of my classes. So with that, I just wanted to acknowledge and honor the history of this place where we care for our gardens and our compost and one another. We grow and eat food here on the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Coast Salish people, including tribes such as the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, Snoqualmie, and Nisqually, among others. And we recognize the importance of lifting up these communities, past, present, and future, as we strive to be thoughtful caretakers of these places where we live, grow food, compost. So thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you for taking some time to be thoughtful about what we're doing. So like Colleen mentioned, we'll be together for about 90 minutes. And in this time, we'll talk about what compost is and how it helps us build healthy soil, which is the literal foundation of good food. And we'll talk about how to use it in the garden, and then some different methods that you can use. So we'll kind of start with some of the what is it that we're talking about? Why do we use it? How do we use it? And then we'll take a break. So there'll be a slideshow and lecture. We'll have a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, we'll talk about various methods and systems that we can use. And if we have a little time at the end, we'll either break out into a conversation or we'll just do some Q&A. We'll see how it goes. So without further ado, I'll just continue on here by starting with what is compost? And so the word compost can be confusing sometimes because it gets mixed up in the realm of, soil, mulch, compost, like all these different elements of our growing medium, right? They're all kind of mixed together. And so it can be helpful to differentiate compost from what we mean when we talk about soil and or what we mean about when we talk about mulch. So compost is both the material and a process, right? So it is both a verb and a noun, right? It's the thing that we're making and it's the process to make that thing. So when we have a bunch of organic material, like here we have some yard clippings and some food waste kind of all mixed together into this pile. This is material that is going to go through the process of compost. We might say it's composting. And then once it has gone through that process and it starts to look like what we think of when we think of our soil, this brown, crumbly, earthy smelling material that doesn't resemble any of these component parts that made it up originally, it's going to look more like the soil. That's the end product, the compost that we're talking about. And this is the material that we might use in our gardens or on our farms. And basically, one quick way of summarizing it could be compost is decomposed, stabilized organic matter, right? Because decomposition is basically when we say something's composting, it's really in the process of decomposing. It's getting broken down, and that is a dynamic process, right? So it's kind of an unfolding. There's lots of activity. There's lots of different organisms and microbes that are helping to make that happen. And oftentimes when we're in the midst of that process, we would say that it's unstable or in the dynamic process, right? So it's just in the shift. So it's not quite reached a more final stage where it's not going to, say, for example, increase or decrease in temperature very much. It's not going to change in appearance or shape much anymore. It's really reached its stable place. And so this is different from soil, which compost can be a part of soil, right? But soil is much more than just compost, right? Soil also contains the parent material like the rocks or the mineral parts, all of the little bits that are kind of the stuff of our soil. And then soil actually is also, it's this it has organic matter like compost in it. It also has lots of living organisms that are there. And then it's also full of space where there's room for air or gas exchange. There is space for water or moisture to kind of flow through it. And so all of that space plus all of the stuff, most of it is rock and mineral. And then a little slice of it is the organic material, but that's the key piece. That little key piece of compost or organic material is an essential part. It's what brings our soil alive, right? And that's different from, say, mulch, which, similar to compost, is also a verb and a noun. It could be the process of putting down a material, but it's also the material itself. Mulch is basically just a protective layer on the surface of the soil. So here is a great example of a mulch on a garden bed. This is what many of us could start doing in our gardens right now as the season is changing, as leaves are falling, and as the temperatures are shifting. Right, it's getting a lot cooler in the air. And so that protective layer on the surface of the soil helps prevent erosion. It helps reduce compaction, that, all the raindrops hitting our soil over the course of many months through the winter causes all that beautiful space we were just talking about in the soil to collapse, right? So the mulch helps to slow it down, give it a little bit of a softer landing. So it reduces compaction. It can also help to regulate the surface temperature of the soil. So it can help protect our plants from frost. In the summer, it could also help hold moisture around the surface of the soil. So mulch provides a lot of wonderful services for us, but it's just a layer on the top. And that layer can be leaves like we see here in this picture. It could also be straw. It could also be burlap on a bed, could be a form of a mulch. Like anything that we put on the surface of the soil as a protective layer, we could call a mulch, including compost, right? So when we spread compost out on the surface level of the soil, we could call it a mulch, right? Sometimes we mix the compost into the soil, and that is when I'd refer to it as a soil amendment, which is what we hear. So if we think of like the idea of a soil amendment, this is the idea of amending or making something better. So we're striving to make the soil better by mixing a little bit of something into it. So sometimes we use fertilizer amendments, right? And you might use something like kelp meal, for example. In the first few inches, you might sprinkle it in and incorporate it in, and that would be like a soil amendment. And compost, similarly, can be used as a soil amendment, right? And so like Colleen and I were talking about before, you know, how compost can help in a lot of ways to reduce our need for like lots of different inputs in the garden, right? So we don't need to put as many fertilizers down, or we may not, it helps reduce our need for some of the conventional products that we think we need to have in the garden, right? Because it's helping to create a healthy underground soil ecosystem by providing a lot of habitat, inoculating it with beneficial bacteria, and provides a lot of services. And that's when we mix it in, we're helping to make the soil better. And when the soil is healthy and has a balanced ecosystem, our plants are healthier and they're getting what they need. So you can use compost as both an amendment or you can use it both ways, or as a mulch. But that should say as a mulch. But you know, and a good example of where I like to use compost as a mulch in the garden is around my perennial plantings. So, for example, every year I put a layer of compost mulch on my raspberries, right? So I'm not really like going in and digging up or mixing that into the soil necessarily, because I don't want to disrupt my raspberry canes very much, but I can layer a couple of inches on the surface of the soil, and eventually through the activity of all of those soil microorganisms, you know, it'll make its way, it'll mix in eventually, but it can also provide a nice level of surface level of protection as well. And then because of basically the way that compost is made through the decomposition process, which you can think of, and I'll probably make this comparison a few different times throughout our class together, but you know, very similar to how when we are digesting food, right, there's all these different microorganisms that live inside of our gut, right? The beneficial, like all creatures that live inside of our gut. When we send that food down into our gut and it gets digested, it's going through a bit of decomposition, right? Those organisms are helping to break that material down. And then in the process of that happening, nutrients are made available to our body. And in a very similar way, when organic material is getting broken down, nutrients get transformed or made into a form from that material. They get made into a form that our plants can use later on. So in that way, our compost is helping to bring some nutrients to the garden. Some of the nutrients will be in the compost, and then some of it will continue to get broken down by small microorganisms continually over time. Okay, I know that was a lot of information, so I'll just pause there. Does anyone have any questions? You can drop it in the chat of like just this first piece. We're going to get into the like why and how after this, but just to start, what is compost? Great. So Alexandra, great question. I'll come back to that. Okay, I'll get into it as we talk about the how to use it. Well, but first it's how does it help, right? So not quite how to use it, but like kind of like the why to use it, right? Like how does it, what is it doing for us? So I kind of mentioned some of this already, but again, compost is helping to bring beneficial bacteria and fungi, beneficial microorganisms to the garden because they're already living in there, having gone in because there's all this wonderful food source for them. And so they're already there. And by the time we bring that compost in, we're helping to inoculate or help to bring more of that beneficial population to the garden. It's also supporting soil life, as we just mentioned, like there are nutrients there. It's helping to bring either the nutrients in a form our plants can use, or to bring material that can continue getting broken down by, say, earthworms and other creatures over time. And in the process, because there's all this biological activity that our compost is helping to bring to our soil, it's also helping to improve our soil structure. And this is an important piece because also a lot of times people will feel like they need to change the structure of their soil. And so when I say that, what I'm talking about is the types of, like the texture, the types of particles that you might have in your soil. We usually talk about these in 3 categories, like sand, silt, or clay. So sandy particles are really large, right? Think about how sand is at the beach, right? Where you have all of these large pieces, water goes through them really easily because they're so big and there's a lot of space between them. So sandy soil might have a hard time holding water. And because of that, also holding nutrients, it might always be dry. This is usually less of an issue here in the Pacific Northwest. Usually what we have are soils that are clay, and this has to do with our geological history, but clay particles are much smaller and they tend to get packed tightly together, kind of like bricks almost. And if you think about something, like when we think of clay, maybe any artists out there might be familiar with pottery, right? And how sticky that material becomes. It holds water really well, and it might take a long time to dry out, right? And because it holds water well, a lot of times it also holds nutrients pretty well, but it's doesn't easily drain. So it might hold the water, but it may also get saturated and not let the water through. This is usually what we're dealing with a lot of our soils. And the cool and magical thing about compost is that it can support us regardless of what type of soil we have. So if you have sandy soil or if you have clay soil, it can help in both situations because the activity of all those beneficial soil microorganisms is going to help break up clay and compacted soil because there's going to be all this action happening in and through the soil, creating tunnels, creating channels, creating space in there to allow for some drainage. And then if we have sandy soil, also all that activity is going to create what sometimes called like bioglues, which help to hold soil together. There's going to be fungal networks forming, and that's also going to help bring a little bit more structure into the soil to retain moisture and hold it. Silty particles are kind of somewhere in between, and most of us have a mix, maybe a little more, a little less of all these different ones. But the reason I'm just really quickly telling you all about these is because we all have some kind of structure to our soil, right? We're not going to change that texture. That's not our goal. What we want to do is make the way that our soil behave better. And we can do that through the addition of organic material like compost, right? So yeah, in all these different situations, organic material is most likely going to be a huge piece of solving the puzzle of helping create soil that drains well and holds water well, holds nutrients, stores carbon, and provides a beneficial habitat for lots of different creatures. Those are all the actions that we're hoping our soil will do. So why make it, right? That might be another question, right? Like, you can buy compost from the store, right? So why would you want to make this at home? And there might be a variety of different reasons that you are interested in making your own compost. The first one, like I mentioned, all gardens or farms or places where we're growing food, they all need some form of compost and organic matter. It's one of the ways we'll support our plants. So you might be making it at home because maybe you have a large area that you want to care for. And if you're already like producing food waste, or you're already trimming things in your yard, it's a free, there's free materials all around you. And if you're just kind of working with those free materials, then you can close the loop for yourself, right? You can recycle those materials on site. Oftentimes, a lot of organic material is sent to landfills and then off gases. And instead of helping to maintain a healthy ecosystem, it's actually contributing to greenhouse gases, right? So at home, we might have a variety of reasons. Maybe we also just are curious, we want to learn, but oftentimes what we're making at home is going to be nutrient rich, it's going to cost less, and it's just going to be a really satisfying process to see it all through. So there might be a few other reasons out there too. Feel free to drop those in the chat. The next thing we'll talk about is how to use it. Right? So I'll go back to Alexandra asked a question in the chat that was, is there a preferred time, like spring or fall? And, like with many questions in gardening, which is very frustrating, but it's mostly because it's context-based, right? Everyone has a different context that they're working with. And so I would say it depends. Maybe depends who you ask. I would say both spring and fall are great times to add compost to the garden. And the reasons you would do both or one or the other are multifold. So for example, if you have a brand new bed that you're going to be growing in, it can be helpful to bring in several inches of compost to the garden bed and dig it across the whole bed in that first 6 to 12 inches or so of the soil. So you might kind of spread it out along the bed, and then you might take something like a digging fork or a shovel, but a digging fork's a little gentler on the soil. And just to kind of get it into that top 6 to 12 inches, that's where most of our annual vegetable plants are going to spend the majority of their lives. And that's where we want to incorporate it in. And so getting started, adding several inches across the whole bed can be a great way to just give your new bed a big boost. And then if you have an existing bed, adding about like 1 inch of compost or so, some people might say a ½ inch, some people might say 1 to 2 inches. There's a lot of different philosophies. I think there are a lot of right ways to garden. And so I think it really just depends on how new your garden bed is, how long you've been gardening there, how much organic material you've been putting onto the garden, and then what have you been observing about in your garden, right? So if you're noticing, say, for example, that going back to the soil structure, if you're noticing that your soil is not draining well, or it's not holding water well, it just keeps drying out, then that might be a reason to add some more organic matter like your compost. Or if you're noticing that your plants don't seem like they're thriving, there's just something not right, you could add a little bit more. But in general, adding about like an inch or so each year, usually like once a year, is enough. Sometimes in my annual, so like, for example, if you're going for the once a year approach, maybe I add my compost in the spring when I'm preparing my garden bed to plant, because that's like a time when I'm turning it over. Sometimes I'll also add compost in the garden in the fall when, if I'm going to plant another round of crops for the fall or for the winter. And that's just a way of replenishing some of the nutrients that have been lost and kind of giving back a little bit for all the material I've taken out from earlier in the season. So that's like one way to use it. Some people like to just put compost on their bed in the fall, and then in the spring, maybe they use a small amount of organic fertilizer. They're both okay to try. So I know that's not a prescriptive answer, but I hope that it's helpful to hear a little bit of the logic of why you might do one thing over another. But in general, if it helps to have just like a cut and dry, like just do this, I would say, just start for yourself each spring, add about an inch or so of compost to your bed and mix it in or incorporate it into that top 6 inches of the soil. And that's a great place to start. You can also use it as a mulch around your plants or lightly on the top of seeds, but I wouldn't put too much on top of your seeds, just a little bit. So those are some different things you could try in terms of like how you're using it. And I see the question from Paula, can you use too much compost in a bed? Again, it's very much like a yes and question, right? There are some people who are of a school of thought that lots of organic matter is okay, and that especially in our annual vegetable systems, where we are kind of intensively growing, so meaning that we're planting things and harvesting things and taking nutrients from the soil pretty rapidly through the year, adding organic matter regularly can be helpful. There's also some schools of thought that would say you don't need that, or that can be too much. I would say I think that it really just depends on what your soil is feeling like, right? And if you're noticing that your soil is draining well, it's also holding water well, and your plants are looking healthy and are thriving, then I think you're doing okay with the amount that you're putting in. And if you're noticing that they're not thriving and not doing well, that might just be a signal to do some more investigation, either through soil testing or by experimenting with adding a little more compost and seeing what happens. Okay. And I noticed, let's see, there was another question here. Can compost have bad bacteria even if you use only good stuff in it, from Lauren? And yeah, of course, with compost, as within any of our like ecosystems, right? Good and bad, I don't know, it can be a hard, there's bacteria and organisms that are beneficial, and then there are ones that we might refer to as like pathogens, or ones that tend to cause a bit more harm in the bed. But really, ecosystems are all about balance, right? Where we have within any system, if a population gets too big, then our balance can be thrown off in the ecosystem. And usually what happens is if there's some kind of pathogen in your soil or a bad bacteria, like you mentioned, usually the reason that would then, say, affect our plants would be because there's not a healthy, thriving ecosystem that can manage that pathogen. Very similar to how, like, our body, when we have a healthy immune system, can handle like a little bit of an infection, or if we are exposed to some kind of pathogen in the air. If our immune system is functioning well, if like kind of all those organisms in our body are in a good place, then we can defend ourselves. And similarly, in the ground, it's similar. That being said, I will also just mention, because I'm not sure, Lauren, exactly what you mean by bad bacteria, but I will say that there are some pathogens that are not safe for us to have in the garden. Say, for example, from like unaged manure, right? Because there might be bacteria like E. coli, which may not necessarily get taken up into some of the plant body, but could make us sick if we're eating the roots or if we're not washing our vegetables well enough. And so in that case, I would say there are some things we want to look out for when we're composting. We'll talk a little bit more about manure towards the end, but that is a case where I'd say just being really careful, because some things like we should never use in the garden or never use in our compost, right? Like dog and cat waste should never be in our compost. And then there's like other waste from other creatures like cows and horses and chickens that we can use, but we want to make sure that we're using it at the right stage so that it's not harmful to our health. Composting, we've gone through a lot of the what, why, how, etc. Now let's get into different methods. So in general, the way that we have been teaching and the way that we often think about our composting methods, we break them into two main categories. One category is yard waste, and one category is food waste. And then of course there's, systems that will mix the two, but I noticed at the beginning of class, someone had very specifically asked, like, how can I do composting while avoiding rats and mice? Like, how do I prevent rodents from getting into my systems? And for sure, there's some things you can do like within the building or constructing of your system, but for sure, separating your food waste from your yard waste can be a really helpful way to deter unwanted creatures from your compost system. But yard waste compost is going to be the type of compost that doesn't have products that we've already prepared or enjoyed in the kitchen, basically. So it might have some of the plant material from plants that we would eat, but it's ones that we haven't, right? And so in general, this is going to look like a mixture of what we think of as green materials. So fresh, think like wet, right? So fresh plant material that still has high water content in it. Oftentimes it is green, so we refer to them as greens. These are our nitrogen rich materials, right? These are our leafy, still kind of in its vegetative state material. And then there's going to be our browns, which are, as they sound, there are dry materials. These are our carbon-rich materials. These can be things like dried leaves, straw, newspaper, cardboard, wood shavings. All of those materials are going to be our browns in there. And in our yard waste system, when we are creating our systems, we're going to use an equal part green and brown. So a lot of times people will put them into a bin system. This is not necessary, but it can be really helpful, especially if you're working with a large amount of yard waste. And so this is an example of a 3-bin system. There are also 2-bin systems. In your resource sheet, I'll show you there's some plans for building systems like this. But typically in a 3-bin system, what we're looking at here is a hot composting system. So within yard waste, there are also 2 categories. So our hot composting and our cold composting. And the hot composting is basically, the main difference is that it is speed, really. With our hot composting, so also kind of going back to Lauren's question about kind of being unsure about like having bad organisms or bacteria in our soil, having a hot compost system can heat the pile up to a degree that it's going to kill any pathogens, it's going to kill any weed seeds. So it can be a great way to have compost that's safe and free of pathogens to ensure that they've been like kind of cooked out of the system. Let's see. And so, so let me go back. So with this system, a 3-bin is typically for a hot compost pile. And with this, we basically want to create a space that is 3 by 3 by 3. So 3 feet wide, 3 feet high, and 3 feet deep. So that, that cubic foot, that size is going to provide the minimum amount of space that you'll need to heat the pile up to the necessary temperature, which is about 130 to 150 degrees. And basically, for our hot piles, what you're going to do is gather together those green and brown materials, and you're going to kind of mix them together. You're going to want them to be, some people say it's kind of like a vinaigrette on a salad kind of level of moisture. So we don't want to be able to like grab any of that material and squeeze it and have water come out. We don't want it to be sopping wet, but we do want to have enough water in there so that the compost materials are glistening. And that's going to help to create the right conditions for our microbes that are going to break down that hot pile. So basically there's, in these piles, we're relying on aerobic bacteria that are going to like the dark, damp, warm environment to get busy breaking down the plant material. And the smaller it is, the more surface area that it is, also the more quickly it'll break down, because our soil microorganisms are very tiny, right? A lot of times you need a microscope to see them, and giving them lots of surface area to work with will help speed up the process. So basically here, what you would do is mix everything together. You'll put it into one of the bins, and then you're going to let that bin start heating up. Depending on the time of year and the materials that you have in there, it might take different times, but here having a compost thermometer, like a soil thermometer, will help you see what's happening. And over time, it's going to get to that range between 130, 150 degrees. Usually we're looking for something around 140. And when it gets up to that heat, we're going to monitor it. And once it starts to drop again, then we're going to take that pile and turn it. And so that timing may vary just depending on your conditions, but someone had asked in the chat, sorry, let me go back. Had asked like, how often do I turn it? And if you have a hot pile, you're going to keep turning it every time that it goes through this arc of warming up, where it's getting to that like 140 degree heat, and then it starts dropping again. And before it drops super low, you're going to turn it and then let it kind of warm up and get to that heat stage. And after you've done that a few times, usually like maybe like a handful of times, then you'll it'll just stop heating up, and that material will also start to not resemble the ingredients that you put into it, right? So it's going to start to look like a soil type material, a crumbly brown, odorless or like earthy, odorless kind of smell. And so that's when you know it's kind of reached its slightly more stable phase. And after that, you would let the material cure. So just because Heather, thank you for this question. How does it heat up? And it's heating up from all of the activity of the microbes. And as it heats up, there are certain types of microbes, like they're called thermophilic microbes. So they're the ones that get activated when the temperatures are really high, certain special types of bacteria. And then they're just going to get to work breaking material down quickly as the temperature continues to rise. Because there's cooler temperature loving microorganisms, and then there's warmer temperature loving ones. And so as it shifts and changes, it's going to change. So let's see what I have here. So that's kind of a really quick explanation of a hot yard waste compost pile. There is a wonderful resource in your resource sheet, which we'll just zip through at the end. That is a 15-minute video of one of my colleagues giving you a demo, and they kind of do the thing where they like speed up his compost making and put music while he's making it, but he explains it really well. And so if you're interested and you have the space to build a hot pile, that can be a great direction to go. If you don't have that space, you could also have a passive compost pile, which might look like something like this in your garden, where you're basically just continually collecting that yard waste material, you're building it up. You could leave it uncovered like this. I'd say in general, most compost will do well if you cover it, or better. It'll start breaking down more quickly. We think of our soil microorganisms. What are the conditions that we like? Dark and damp, right? And so if we're leaving it exposed, then we're not creating the most ideal condition for them. So if you cover it with a piece of burlap, or you cover it with a tarp, that'll create some more ideal conditions for that to start breaking down. This may take, depending on also what's in there, how big the pieces are, it may take up to like a year to really fully break down. But it can be just a nice, easy way to collect materials, keep them on site, know that you're going to use them at a future date somewhere in the garden. People will sometimes use a 2-bin system for this, or even just like kind of using any kind of like wire mesh area. You could, a passive system can look like a lot of different things, but it's basically just collecting those greens and browns together and layering them and then leaving them over a longer period of time. If you're going to do that, you might just want to avoid putting weeds or clippings from your garden that have seeds in them, right? So maybe you catch your weeds before they go to seed, or if you have a concern that something in your garden has a pathogen, like let's say that you have a plant that looks like it has a disease on it, but you're not sure, that might be a good choice to send to the municipal compost, or just keep apart from your passive pile, right? Because that pile is not going to heat up, and so it's not going to get to that temperature that's going to get rid of any pathogens. Lauren asked, how much or how often do you recommend watering? And so, yeah, like this is a good question too, right? Because we have a really wet winter, right? And so that's another reason you might want to keep your pile covered, because then you can control how much moisture there is. If your pile gets too wet, likely what you'll notice happening is that anaerobic bacteria are going to take over in that area, and it's going to start to smell really funky, right? Think of like An anaerobic system often is one in which there's no air in there, right? So because of that, things are just stewing, and usually it gets a little stinky. So if you're noticing that your pile is smelly, that could be part of what's going on. It could also be an imbalance in your carbon to nitrogen ratio. So you may want to just add some more carbon material, some more of that dry material. And yes, turning it, if you notice that maybe because of the time of year, like because of the rain or because you added too much water, you could always turn it and help redistribute that moisture, help mix it up. People often will pull it out, kind of like on this picture, they'll pull it out onto a tarp so that they can kind of mix it a little bit better. But yeah, the moisture level we're looking for is damp, right? A vinaigrette on a salad. So just glistening leaves, not too wet, not like a soup. And Heather asked, can you get sick from turning it? Like if it gets in your skin? You know, no, I mean, I'm not a health official, so I won't say, don't quote me on this, but I wouldn't worry about getting sick from your compost. If anything, you know, similar to how I've heard people talk about how, like beneficial health outcomes from having worked in your garden, right? From being exposed to the microorganisms in the soil, that there's some small amount of benefit that we're getting, or maybe it's a large one, from accessing it. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I think if anything, just having a little bit of like diversity in ecosystems, and including like our body as an ecosystem, right, is beneficial. And so being exposed in that way to all of that plant material, I think is more beneficial than anything. If your pile is anaerobic and it's really stinky, then yeah, you might not like it. Might not like working in it. Or if, you know, or if you're maybe you have sensitive skin, then you might want to think about just wearing some gloves and long sleeves and things like that. But I wouldn't be worried about any adverse health outcomes. I'd say if anything, it's like little miniature boosts to your immune system. Okay, so yard waste composting, one direction to go. It usually is hot or it's cold, and it's a mixture of the greens and browns, or the carbon and the nitrogen. Another form is food waste composting, which we also lump together with vermicompost or worm composting. So the vermin being the worms. There are three main methods that we usually teach when we're talking about food waste composting. One is just like trench food waste composting. For the question earlier of like, how do I avoid rodents? This one is definitely the most tricky, because if you're not burying your food waste deep enough, it's not going, it is going to attract pests, right? And so the idea is that you bury it at least 12 inches in the soil, so pretty far down, and then you're burying it really well. And this is just kind of like that passive yard waste system. It's just a passive pile. It's going to break down over time. This can be a great way to like transform the area where you're growing slowly, right? Because it's going to take that material some time to break down. And then eventually what it'll be is very rich soil down below. But that's one method. Another method is what we would call a food digester. And so there are different plans for it, but essentially what a food digester is, kind of like this green cone that folks may have seen. Different municipalities around our area have made these available at different times, but basically there's a basket or maybe some kind of, almost looks like a little cage that gets buried underground, and it has holes in it, but the holes are not large enough for rodents to get through. And sometimes they come and they feel like they are. You can line them with hardware cloth just to be sure. But basically, because there are holes in it, it's going to allow for the natural organisms that are present in your soil to come and go freely and start breaking down the or the food waste material that you put into the cone. And then the cone itself, or the piece that's above ground, is going to help trap some thermal energy. It's going to heat up from above and create a nice, warm, damp, dark environment to break things down. It might look like this. This is kind of a crosscut. This is what it looks like alone. So there's this basket at the bottom, the cone at the top, a little lid. It could also be, sorry, this photo is a little blurry, but this is basically another version of a food digester that is like a steel trash can, basically, like a galvanized steel one. And then you drill holes through the bottom in various parts. And then you could just bring like a bungee or something around the top, but it's the same idea. You'd bury it about like a third to 2/3 down, like in the ground. And then you would just start filling it. And that material would it's basically like a natural worm bin, kind of, because we're just using the creatures that are underground. These can be great systems to choose if you have some perennial areas of the garden. So for example, we have them in our learning gardens near our apple trees. So just maybe like, I don't know, 10 feet away or so, like really like close to the trees, but not right up on them. And these we just leave in the ground. Some people will go through and they might harvest out a very small amount of compost because it does help to clean these from time to time. But in general, these are kind of the kind of systems that are a passive breakdown of that food waste compost, and you're just going to fill it. And each time you fill it, it's going to get lower and it's just going to continue. It might look like it's never going anywhere if you keep filling it every day, but basically that material is always just going to be breaking down, and it's going to slowly send nutrients out to the surrounding area. So it's a really great choice for perennial plantings or around trees or shrubs. Another choice could be a worm bin, which sometimes they just look like a simple wooden box structure, and you create bedding of those carbon materials. So you'll add leaves and maybe newspaper that's shredded up, and you'll create some bedding, cardboard into there. You add your worms, and then you add food waste, and over time they'll break it down and they'll travel across the bin. There are also designs like vertical worm bins where they're going to travel, instead of traveling like across one way, they're going to travel up. And then there are also designs like this where you could kind of do a double Rubbermaid container. We call this the off-the-shelf worm bin design. And we have these plans on the Tilth website. These are great for small spaces, like if you live in a small apartment. They're a really great way to move through some of your food waste and get this really rich, we call them worm castings. They're basically worm poo, and they're a wonderful amendment in the garden. They're basically like this specialized type of compost that's really rich and gentle in the garden. Oh, I love that. Colleen says that she has one of those under her desk at work. How fun. That's so great. Yeah, I read somewhere today, like there was somebody who was saying they lived in a small apartment and they created like an ottoman that was a worm bin just because they didn't have anywhere else to put it. So they had created just somewhere to put up their feet, which I thought was fun. And no, Heather, they don't smell bad. And I think you're referring to the worm bin. They don't smell bad. They shouldn't smell bad. If you do have some smells, that could be a sign for that you need to do a little bit of troubleshooting, right?
I had teachers who had them in the classroom, period. No smell whatsoever.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So yeah, they can be great to have in the classroom. They're a great place to do learning about decomposition, about compost, and it's a really rich garden amendment. So like it says here too, with food waste compost, it's high in nutrients. It oftentimes requires less labor than, say, the turning of those big piles that we mentioned, and it can be done inside. So in urban areas, it can be a really wonderful choice to think about in terms of making your own compost. So really quick, just while we're getting close, I want to make sure we get all of these. So a few other composting methods I wanted to mention because, the ones that I already shared in terms of the food waste and the yard waste and using food digesters, worms, digging a trench, or doing the hot or the cold pile, those are usually what we find are most common and what we've been teaching. Those are not the only methods out there for composting. There are lots of different ways to break material down. And so a few others that are worth mentioning, right, are aged animal manure. So this is literally like what it sounds. So animal manure that's either gone through an intentional compost period or has been left to sit for a long enough period of time that the pathogens that may have been a danger when this compost or when this manure was fresh are no longer. Usually that's about a year for a lot of animal compost or animal waste, but it can vary depending on the type of waste that you're looking at. In general, using aged material, oftentimes if it's aged and it already has some bedding in it, that can help break it down to like something like straw. Curbside collection, right, or municipal compost. This is something that, is a great choice. Even, like if all else fails and you're just like, I just don't think I can make this myself, I'm definitely going to be using it. Making sure that you're sending any of your food waste, any of your yard waste out to our municipal facilities helps to keep that material within our local regional loop. So that is a really big benefit. And they're using a hot method. And so they're able to get that compost up to a really high heat in a way that oftentimes is really hard for home growers. Another type is sometimes we call it chop and drop. And this is basically the idea that as your plant material, as you're weeding or pruning or trimming grass around the garden, you can just do a chop and drop where you're just kind of laying that material down on the surface of your soil as if it were a mulch. And that can be another way of recycling nutrients on site. It's not going to create, a rich compost material like what you might find in some of the other processes, but it is going to provide a great surface and like as a mulch, and then it is going to break down eventually over time. But it's a little passive, right? It's not an active system that we're managing. Sometimes people, this is just a crosscut, not advocating for putting your soil or composting in a fish tank, but this is basically a crosscut looking at what sometimes we would call like lasagna gardening or a layered mulching on a bed. And so this can be a great choice, especially at this point in time in the year, because if you're putting your garden to bed and you have a bed that you finally took out your tomatoes because today was maybe the last day of sunshine for a long time, and you don't know what to do next, if you want to help build your soil up for this next season, or if you have a new bed that you want to be able to work in next spring, one choice could be to start layering a bunch of different materials. So thinking again of those greens and browns. So you might layer a little bit of aged manure with some yard clippings, with some leaves, with some finished compost, and you might just layer up greens and browns and compost materials all together to build the soil over time. And that one is, I'd say like in the more experimental realm, where you can kind of take the materials you have on site, see what happens. It's a passive system. It's going to break down over the many months through the winter. You cover it with some burlap, and it's providing the service of all the services of a mulch because it's protecting the soil through the winter, and it's going to break down slowly over time. And most likely when you uncover it in April, it's going to look just like soil. So that's another option, the lasagna mulching. There's also compost tumblers, which folks may have seen. Oftentimes these are used, well, they can be used for both food waste, yard waste. A lot of times they're meant, I think, for yard waste. But this is basically a system where we're elevating that plant material up, and then we're using the physics, I guess, of like this system to help us with the turning. So ergonomically, it's a little easier to work with. We don't have to take like a pitchfork or some tool to get in there and turn and aerate our pile, but it's already in this enclosed container. I have heard mixed things about people having success with this. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that people sometimes treat this as a container that you can just add something to little bit by little bit. But I think the design is meant to be filled and then tumbled until it's done. So for something like this, I'd say, you know, you can either store stuff in it or just store your stuff in a pile. And then when you have enough material to fill about 2/3 or 3/4 of the bin, fill it, get it a little bit moist, and then turn it, you know, every day until it starts breaking down. And don't keep adding to it, because then it'll just feel like it's never breaking down, because things will be at different points in their decomposition. So that's one thing there. Another method, so this is bokashi, or basically it's a Japanese composting method for food waste that uses beneficial microbes, a specific strain of bacteria to ferment basically our food. And it's an anaerobic process. And you basically would add the bokashi material along with your food waste from time to time until you fill a container. And then over time, that material would break down and you'd have like this rich food waste compost that also has a lot of beneficial microorganisms in it. This one I'm excited about. I'm still learning about it, but I have, just a lot of curiosity about it. There's some really cool folks sharing about bokashi right now. And then of course there's hugelkultur, which is a form of gardening, and it's utilizing composting principles, because really, well, and also just mimicking how things break down out in nature by kind of thinking about how soil gets made over time, right? So mimicking, say, like woody debris like forest floor, and then having different layers of mulch material, your greens and your browns that you're going to layer up into the mound. And over time, that material will continue breaking down. And so in this way, it's both, you might use some of the compost on the hugelkultur bed, and it's everything in there is going to be in the process of decomposing, but it's lower and it's happening underneath the main layer that you're growing in. So it's not like the active breakdown right at the base of your plants, which is important. So those are some additional composting methods to think about, to consider. It's 7:20, so I'm going to go ahead and give you a sneak peek at our class outline, which has all the information I just shared. And in addition, towards the bottom, there's a few different things. There's this making compost hot pile video. It's about 15 minutes, really helpful. There's a few different booklets if you want to read more about just kind of general composting methods. This Tilth composting page I wanted to take you to because it has some designs in there, which can be really helpful, just a helpful place to start. So if you click on the composting method and bins and learn more, and you go down, they have designs. So they have worm bin plans, like for a large worm bin. They have a 2-bin plan. If you're curious about that, they describe all the different types of materials that you need, the measurements, etc. And then they give you some instructions for how to build it. There's also the off-the-shelf worm bin plan in here, which I think is really helpful. And they give you kind of a basic description of how to build that as well. All of these are free and available on our website. So that I just wanted to point out there. If you are interested in worms, I'd say probably one of the most fun and interesting books out there is Worms Eat My Garbage by Mary Applehoff. That can be a great one to explore. And then I've just included a few other resources trying to diversify from just having like books and articles, but I included a podcast from Encyclopedia Botanica, which is the Seattle Urban Farm Company. Can check them out. And then also there's kind of this cool NPR during the pandemic put out like a infographic style article about composting that I thought was really interesting too. So trying to touch on all different kinds of learning styles here, but there are so many rabbit holes to go down with composting. And I hope that whatever you're most interested in, there's enough here to get you started. And yeah, thank you everyone for your time. I know there were some great questions. So I think what I'm going to do instead of this breakout is just stop my share and kind of get into just some broad questions together here. So let's see. Okay. So Kayla asked, would you worry about clippings that may have been in contact with pesticides or been in a construction zone dealing with silica dust? Great questions. For sure, yes, I would definitely be concerned about clippings that have come in contact with pesticides. I would not put those in compost that you are intending to put into your garden. A great example sometimes of what this can look like is people, for example, they'll buy straw or they'll purchase some manure that had been mixed in with like bedding material, like other types of straw. And sometimes straw can have herbicide residue on it because maybe it's the type of straw that was a Roundup Ready product. And then we bring that back and the residual herbicide residue takes a while to break down and then can cause a lot of harm in our gardens. And so definitely, one of the advantages of making our own compost is that we know what's going in it. And if you're ever bringing something into this space and you don't know what's going in it, it can't hurt to ask. And so I'd always encourage you to ask or to try and investigate a little bit more, because that would be something I would be concerned about. I am not sure about the silica dust though. If anybody else has an answer there, you're welcome to share, but we could also investigate a little more about that. I mean, for sure, if you know that there's like silica dust present around, like, I would, there are even just some things in like a potting soil mix sometimes that aren't great on their own to be breathing in, but then when they're mixed in with all of the other materials, they're not floating in the air in the same kind of way. So if you're working in a space like a previous construction zone, then maybe just wearing a mask while you're getting your materials together and making sure that you're adding some water to it so that those dust particles are not floating in the air. Things like that. Colleen, yes, you let the bokashi, yeah, you basically just let it sit. I'm not sure how long it is. I need to do a little more research about it, but I think my understanding is that you want to kind of layer the bokashi material. It's usually like the microbes mixed with like a bran, and you'd mix that material in with like a chunk of your, so let's say you fill your home food waste bin, like your compost bin at home, and you wouldn't want to make the bokashi bin your bin. You want to like fill like a decent amount of compost material, put the bokashi in, then put that material in, and keep layering it until it's full. And then once it's full, you just let it sit for a period of time. But I guess that'll vary a little bit. And yes, Henry, you can use coffee grounds in a compost bin for sure. Strangely enough, I believe coffee grounds are considered a nitrogen source, even though they are brown. So that could just be something to consider as you're like, you know, if you're mixing things together in your system, that might tip you over the edge of having too much nitrogen and not enough carbon. So you just may want to balance it out there. But yeah, they can be a great product to add into your bin. Great. And then yes, you purchase the bokashi online. You know, that's a resource I could put in there. I don't think we have one on there, but there is a farmer in the Portland area who's been doing a lot of bokashi education and research. I'll link to some of his information. So if folks are interested and want to learn more, I can put that in there. And oh, and Colleen, I think it was just to me, but Colleen said sometimes coffee places will have free grounds for you to take just to use in compost.
I'm just gonna let you know.
Yeah, you know, that's so funny. You know, I forget that. So for years I was a barista, and sometimes we would have gardeners who would just bring us the bin so that every time like we made an espresso, you know, you like dump the like little espresso puck and we would just like fill it for them. So it's so funny that I forgot that. Yeah, check in with your local baristas and bring them a little bin to dump all their espresso grounds in. Great.
And one of the questions earlier was about the 3-bin system. Like, why 3 bins?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it has to do with just like having space to turn the pile. Because the hot system is an aerobic process, meaning that we want to make sure that we're creating space for lots of air circulation in there. You're going to need to move it to keep the temperature up during that thermophilic stage. And so I guess it doesn't have to be in like a 3-bin system, but that design is meant so that you might have like one bin where where the material is heating up, and then another bin where it's either you're collecting it or it's done, and that way you always have one you could turn into.
Yeah, if you add any new stuff to your compost pile, you're basically starting the process over. So work with, like, when you're done with the pile, turn that, work on that, and then if you still want to collect, that's the different bin. It's a different pile.
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise you will never be done.
Yeah, and you'll feel like, oh, like why none of this material is not breaking down, and it's just because they'll be at different stages, right? Because the new stuff you put in won't be at the same stage as the other material that's like going through it. So let's see, we had a couple more questions. Oh, Paula asked if, you know, so like, are you, I think Paula might be asking if the worms maybe outside are the same worms that you might buy for like a real worm bin. And you know, they may not be. Oftentimes the worms that you'll see being shared and used in a like a vermiculture bin will be red wiggler worms, which I find so hard to say. And you can purchase those. You can like get some from someone who already has a worm bin. The garden hotline sells red wiggler worms. You can also sometimes connect with plant nurseries. Will sometimes have them. Sometimes hardware stores have them, or I think back in the day, people would say like, go to the bait and tackle shop, and they would have like red wiggler worms. But it's also okay if you have a, you know, if you have like if you have something like a food digester, that's kind of similar, but just a little different. Similar process. And
yeah, the thing with the worms is that the red wiggler worms are they have a different habitat than your normal earthworms. Like if you dig in your garden, you dig, you know, quite a few inches down, that's when you're going to come across all those worms that naturally live in your garden. The compost worms, if you would find those naturally in your garden, if you had like a rotting pile of leaves and you move the leaves and they're all kind of at the surface, like they only live in the top little inch or half inch of soil because they're trying to eat the dead things on top. So if you put in normal earthworms, that's not their habitat, is to eat all that stuff you have in there.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay. Let's see, we'll just grab, I think there's maybe one more question here. Can you use regular shredded documents in your compost, or should you use newspaper? Lisa asked it. I'll just answer this last one. I feel like you can just use your like shredded documents. I'd say the main thing to be conscientious of is like shiny paper or papers that have films on them. Oftentimes have some kind of like plasticky or like plastic residue on them, and so those may be ones to skip. But any kind of like dry natural paper should work. But thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you.